Goes to show you how gives you some sense of when you write it, your own introduction, how good it sounds. So let me welcome you again. I'm Roger Hertog, chairman of the Tikvah Fund. And on behalf of Eric Cohen, who's the executive director, who has really been a mastermind of most of what has been done at Tikvah, both in the United States and Israel, and Amiot Cohen, who's managing director and leader of the Tikvah Fund in Israel, let me welcome you on all of their behalfs to what I think is a historic conference. Let me begin by saying, although Sarah touched on it, saying the most obvious. The reason the Tikvah Fund was born was because of the enormous generosity of one man, Zalman Chaim Bernstein, of blessed memory, who died 20 years ago. He was a very important man in my life and in the life of many others in this audience. And through his philanthropy, he became important to Jews in Israel, Russia, and the United States. And all of this was accomplished in anonymity. His name cannot be found on many places. As Sarah mentioned, we're honored today to have Mem Bernstein here, Zalman's widow and chairman of Avichai, and Arthur Fried, Zalman's visionary executor, who are with us here today. Thank you, Arthur. Thank you, men. Please stand. And thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules to participate in this extraordinary gathering. Over 700 strong, by any measure, an impressive showing for a first conference. This is an important step to forge, to build a true conservative movement in Israel. The conference on Israeli conservatism, as you might expect, is about ideas. The fact is that ideas do matter. In fact, ideas are the only thing that matters. Our purpose in holding this event is straightforward: to bring together like-minded individuals, political activists, policymakers, intellectuals, journalists, rabbis, politicians, philanthropists, and concerned citizens, so that together we can work to influence to what we think is the best for Israel's future, because we care deeply about the state of Israel. In my case, I came to Israel approximately 50 years ago with my young bride, Susan. She's still quite young. I've aged a little. But the moment I landed in Ben Gurion Airport, without having anticipated it, I became a lifelong Zionist. And while preparing for this conference, I thought not only about Zalman, who I know would have loved to have been here, who would have loved walking around and talking to everyone here, maybe even arguing with a couple of people, but also about the many miracles that have transformed Israel since I first arrived 50 years ago. Since that first visit, I've returned about 60 or 70 times. But preparing for this conference made me step back, take stock, think about the longer sweep of history, and maybe try to understand something about that miracle of Israel. Who could have possibly forecast what this country has achieved? That's humbling in and of itself, because it would have been very hard. Today, the Jewish state is stronger than it has ever been in its history. However, we're not here to only praise Israel. Whether this miracle continues to unfold in the extraordinary way it has is in essence dependent upon people like us in this room. And we have to be realistic about what our successes in building the Jewish state and those areas and then also see the things in building the state that haven't been so successful. I'd like to focus today on economic policy and think about it in a larger sense. It's obvious that economics is not the only thing, or even maybe the most important thing, we conservatives should be concerned with. The conservative tradition is a big, powerful, broad one, concerning itself with the health and strength of our nation, our religion, our families, and responsible government. The ideal, the belief of economic freedom has had a difficult time establishing itself in Israel. We know Israel was born as a socialist country, built on heavy taxation, heavy regulation, cartels, controls that continue to this day. The result is that the Israeli economy consistently suffers in many key areas from weak growth in many sectors. So let me try to dimension how important is it for the Israeli economy to have strong growth. Consider just a couple of simple, basic numbers. If the economy grows at 2% a year, it takes 36 years to double in size. If the economy grows at 4% a year, and there are examples around the world where this has occurred, this is not unique or something impossible to achieve. That sustained rate of growth, you'll be able to double the size of the economy in 18 years, half the time. The difference between 4% a year and 2% a year has this huge, huge impact. Albert Einstein said the most important invention of the 20th century was compound interest. This is the true definition of compound interest. The difference of 2% a year cuts the time to double the size of the economy in half. It's obvious to all that strong economic growth has a strategic significance not only for stronger national defense, which is a strategic imperative, and a higher standard of living for all Israelis, but also because of growth, better opportunities for all Israeli citizens, irrespective of their age and even their education. So many of you, thank you. So many of you may be asking, don't we already have the answer? Israel's annual growth rate is approximately 3%, and just look at what's been achieved in the technology sector in a relatively short period of time. I counter and say, yes, but. The question is, why has technology been so successful, and its success hasn't been replicated in other parts of the economy? So think of it this way. The technology sector accounts for between 12 and 15% of the US economy. There's not exact data, but it's pretty good numbers. And employs 200,000 to 300,000 people. Israel has more companies on NASDAQ, this very significant stock exchange in the United States and the world. Most of those are related to technology, than any other country in the world except the United States. This is all very impressive. But the problem for Israel is that the rest of the economy, which employs 3 million people, 10 times as many as the tech sector, has grown at a much smaller pace. Not entirely stagnant, but growth continues to be slow year after year. After all citizens should be asking, why such success in one part of the economy and not in the other? I think at least part of this answer can be found in what is in many cases an obscure, he shouldn't be, Anglo-Austrian economist philosopher named Frederick Hayek. Hayek was a formidable thinker, big ideas, and in his early part of his life was really rejected. Many years later, he became really an acknowledged thinker that had to be studied or should be studied in every college. At the risk of oversimplification, the most succinct summation of Hayek's thinking on this idea is in one sentence of his final book. The title of that book is firmly embedded in our political lexicon: the fatal conceit. Here's what he says in a sentence. The curious task of economics is to demonstrate to men and women how little they really know what they imagine they can design. In other words, socialist economies administered by a select group of highly educated, qualified people, and in most cases, seriously committed to trying to do something good, basically is unable to really gather enough information to understand what is happening, because they work, so to say, in closed rooms, planning what should be right based on models that they've created, that they think will work in the real world. But they are unable to really have at their grasp information about what's happening in the real world, what's happening with customers, what's happening with competitors. They have a closed system. The economy, they run an economy in many parts, and this is true for the largest part of the domestic economy. Now, how does this economic theory apply to small companies using the technology analog that make up a significant portion of the tech sector? We all know small companies, I certainly knew this from my experience in Wall Street, will fail. Large numbers of them fail because they get their business model wrong, because they don't maybe have the right financing, or maybe they don't understand what's happening with their competitors. Others will succeed because they'll be able to adjust their strategies to what is happening to competitors or is demanded by customers. I can't underscore how powerful it is. The fatal conceit actually gives one the sense that people think they can forecast, they can design what the future is. The most innovative businessmen are constantly thinking about what could go wrong, how can I get better information? Market information, what happens matters to the success of businesses that succeed. The other important advantage, which should not be understood, and maybe even the most important advantage, a very large portion of the tech sector is export-driven, and its entrepreneurs are permitted to work without the burdensome regulation of governments and the oversight of how their business is being run. This is not the case for the largest part of the Israeli economy, which in one way or another, as any of you who are involved in it know, is held back by government oversight, unions, price controls, excessive tax regulation, cartels, and ultimately protectionism, protecting some important industries for whatever reason they are protected. As for the other countries worldwide, so for Israel, this is a prescription for slower growth and lack of innovation. One only has to think about what so sadly has happened to Europe over the last decade. much slower growth, difficulty in their countries in terms of employment for their citizens, because a significant part of their economic life is run out of a handful of office buildings in Brussels by well-educated, extremely capable men, but who think they know how to run this economy in whatever the country they're involved in. At this stage, the interesting question is, what can conservatives do to stimulate the domestic economy? How can these ideas help unleash the capabilities, the power of the Jewish people, excuse me, to substantially increase Israel's economic growth rate? This is where the rise of conservative politics in America and other economically free countries becomes relevant. And this is where I think there is some applicability to understand this story and how it might have a huge influence in Israel. As most of you, I'm sure you're aware that 70 years ago, at the end of World War II, there was nothing resembling what we know today in America as the modern conservative movement. Republicans and Democrats were more or less alike on favoring economic policies that had very large government intervention. Not so different from Israel today. In 1955, and this goes to show what a couple of people can do, a handful of people, a brilliant 30-year-old public intellectual, I was 14 then, and most of you weren't born. This conservative intellectual was named William F. Buckley. He founded a magazine, National Review magazine. Its circulation in the early years was 20,000 copies in a nation of 170 million in those years. But it goes to show what a small magazine that really deals with big ideas, because ideas do matter, what it can accomplish. As Buckley would later recount, his great challenge was how to fuse, how to bring together the many different weak and bickering groups on the political right. Libertarians, religious, social, economic conservatives, even embryonic at that point in time, neoconservatives. His task was to persuade them they had enough in common that they could in good conscience come together, creating a powerful political movement that became known as modern conservatism. He accomplished that, and he accomplished it brilliantly. But still it took another 20 years before a great political leader appeared on the national and the world stage in the United States to put these ideas and policies into practice. And this politician was, of all things, an actor. In fact, a grade B actor, meaning not a very good one. No one in 1960 or 65 or 70 would have ever predicted that Ronald Reagan would become the great conservative president of our era. A man who had in fact voted for Franklin Delano Roosevelt 3 times in his youth. But when Reagan began to run for president in 1980, he remembered the lessons from that magazine, from those experiences 20 years ago, that in order to win in politics, in an American case it was the presidency, you had to build a large tent of conservatives, and he did. And it's important to say, it too hasn't been a complete success. America doesn't do everything right on this. God only knows how true it is. But my point isn't that the political situation in Israel is just like the United States was in the 50s. Although I believe economically there are similarities. It's not perfect, but there are similarities. My point is that if conservatism is to succeed in Israel, in becoming a political force, in changing the economic life of the country, disparate groups will come together, will need to come together to understand that all of their interests, all of their coalitions, all of their people to work together. Of course, a conservative movement can't be defined by just one or two issues. It will require creating a unique synthesis that this is right for this country. A synthesis embracing all aspects of national life, of which economics is just one. It may be an important one, but it is still one. The task at hand, in essence, for groups like this is especially difficult because the intellectual life in Israel, meaning the forces that control colleges and universities, that control, in many cases, the media, that control the courts and the government bureaucracies, as you are, I think, aware, are not quite sympathetic or maybe even hostile in some way to this kind of political conservatism. On the road to conservative victory, ideas and the promulgation of ideas are on one part, and they're absolutely a vital part. Ideas are a big thing. But ultimately, to prevail, ideas must manifest themselves in the cultural and political processes that will shape Israel's destiny. That is the challenge before conservatism in Israel today. That is our challenge. And I think it's a challenge that can be won. And that'll be up to you guys. Thank you so much.